Take any of the crises that we face: nuclear weapons, environmental catastrophe, destruction of democracy, pandemic, others, racism, xenophobia, many others. They have solutions, and we know the solutions.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam, adab, and welcome to Habib University's 6th Yohsin lecture. I am Wasif Rizvi, president of Habib University. The title Yohsin for this lecture series is drawn from Habib University's motto, which is Qimatu kulli imri ma yohsanahu, a saying of Imam Ali, which means everyone's worth is in their yohsan, as to what they do with excellence, with grace and beauty, and with goodness and service for others. It's almost impossible to imagine a more appropriate speaker than Professor Noam Chomsky to reflect this spirit of Yohsin, in view of his brilliant and unparalleled corpus of wide-ranging intellectual work. Noam Chomsky has also provided the most quoted line in New York Times history, arguably the most important intellectual alive, which is arguably the most credible thing that New York Times has ever printed. Professor Chomsky is a writer of more than 100 books. He's currently the laureate professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona and institute professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Let me briefly introduce the co-host of this conversation, my friend and colleague, Professor Christopher Taylor, who is Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Dean of Faculty and Professor of Comparative Liberal Studies at Habib University. Chris and I are delighted and honored to have this opportunity with Professor Chomsky. For the past 4 decades, Noam has been the leading voice in the world, highlighting savage and rampant march of neoliberalism and its devastating consequences, manifesting in the convergence of this grim trio of fading democracy, escalated nuclear threat, and environmental catastrophe. The Indian subcontinent happens to be among the most volatile flashpoints for all three: nationalist fascism, nuclear bravado, and racing towards inhabitability for about 2 billion people. These dangers reached a horrific crescendo following the 2016 election of Donald Trump, which resulted in an exponential increase in all three of these terminal threats posed to human civilization, which leads to our topic for today. Summarily, has the outcome of 2020 elections given humanity a chance? Let's ask this question to Professor Noam Chomsky. Yes, sir.
Very pleased to be with you, at least virtually. I wish it were possible again, actually, perhaps one of these days when this plague is over. It's been 20 years, I think, since I've been in Pakistan, quite a few years. We should first, we have, of course, been through a momentous election in the United States, and the last few weeks ago. It's still not over. Come back to that in a moment. We should recognize what a unique moment in human history this is. Humans have been on Earth a few 100,000 years. The present generation is facing questions that have never arisen in human history and that will never arise again in human history unless they are given an appropriate answer. So that's a tremendous burden and a remarkable challenge. We are at a moment of confluence of severe crises. Eminent scientists, political analysts try to encapsulate their conception of the world security situation by a clock called the Doomsday Clock. When the minute hand of the Doomsday Clock reaches midnight, that means termination of the species. The clock was set in motion shortly after the dropping of the atomic bombs in 1945. It was then set at 7 minutes to midnight. It's oscillated over the years. Every year that President Trump has been in office, the minute hand has moved closer to midnight. 2 years ago, it moved to the closest to the midnight it had ever been. Last January, the analysts abandoned minutes. They moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. They mentioned 3 crucial issues. One, of course, the threat of nuclear war, which in fact is growing, according to some senior analysts like William Perry, is greater than it has ever been in the past 75 years. Second, the threat of environmental catastrophe, which is severe and increasing, and if we do not deal with it soon, we'll likely reach irreversible tipping points, and it's just a matter of waiting not very long till organized human society becomes impossible. One of the first regions to suffer severely from the ongoing catastrophe is in fact South Asia. That's already in a severe environmental crisis with drought, shortage of water, glaciers melting, sources of the main rivers declining, and if matters continue on its present course, it will literally not be habitable by human beings within not very long. Bangladesh is a coastal plain largely. The last severe cyclone, 10% of it was underwater. Hundreds of millions of people. Nobody knows what will happen to them as the seas continue to rise. Those are the first 2, and no area of the world will be spared. That's clear. The third severe crisis that the clock measured was the deterioration of democracy worldwide. At first, it doesn't sound as if that belongs at the level of the other 2, but it actually does. And the reason is, unless there is an engaged, informed public committed to dealing with the crises that we face, there's no chance of dealing with them. Autocrats and demagogues will not do it. It has to be an engaged, informed public in a vibrant democracy. So these are the 3 major crises they identified. This work came out just before the pandemic hit. It's a 4th major crisis. The Trump administration continued its project of dismantling the arms control regime, which has offered some protection against the severe threat of nuclear war. And it's worth remembering that any nuclear war among powers of any significance, certainly Pakistan and India, will be essentially terminal. The effects on a country that strikes first will be lethal. The rest of the world lethal, if only from a nuclear winter, which is very likely to be the results of a major nuclear strike. The Trump administration is continuing at this very moment, to open up new areas of the country to fossil fuel exploration, including the last nature reserve in the country. It's continuing to dismantle regulations which impose some constraints on the use of fossil fuels, and incidentally also protect the population from emissions which are extremely harmful to health, particularly in this period when people are facing respiratory diseases escalated by the lack of emissions controls. As far as deterioration of democracy is concerned, it's proceeded very far. The Trump administration has purged the executive branch of the government of any independent voices. Nothing left except sycophants. The Congress years ago had installed inspectors general to monitor the performance of executive offices for corruption, malfeasance. They began to look into the enormous swamp of corruption that Trump had created in Washington. He took care of that just by firing them. They're gone. Well, let's come to the election. There was an election on November 4th. In my view, the election was a total disaster. The Republicans, who are not that different from Trump, they drifted off the political spectrum years ago. If you look at international comparisons, they're ranked alongside the parties in Europe with neo-fascist origins. Alternative for Deutschland, Le Pen's National Front, and so on. They've basically stopped being a parliamentary party. It's a party of environmental denialists, ultranationalists, evangelical Christians, militarists, xenophobic, racist, white supremacist. Very dangerous organization. It's the world is suffering out from it severely, but in fact, it is the least of the four crises. Severe though it is, and dominant though it is at the moment, we will emerge from the pandemic at terrible cost and needless cost. We can see that it's needless cost by the fact that some countries have dealt with it. By January 10th, Chinese scientists had identified the virus very rapidly, only a few weeks after the first symptoms had appeared. They had sequenced the genome, provided to the entire world. By January 10th, virologists all over the world knew what they were facing, knew the kinds of measures that had to be taken. Some places, the measures were taken, others not. And we see the differences. In China, the center of the crisis, life is pretty much back to normal. South Korea had a severe outbreak, dealt with it expeditiously and effectively. Situation is reasonably under control. Europe waited too long, but finally most of Europe began to take significant measures. Others didn't. India didn't. Brazil didn't. The United States didn't. France didn't. These are the countries in the lead in facing a pandemic catastrophe. The United States, the government has simply given up. It has informed the public that there's nothing we can do. And unfortunately, the American public has been inundated with massive propaganda from the right wing, which tells people there's no crisis. It's a hoax. The liberals made it up. A large portion of the population sees no problem. People are literally dying in hospitals, claiming to the nurses that there's no disease. It's a hoax. This is a shocking situation. And the same is true on all fronts. China, they're way in the lead in developing alternative energy, far beyond the rest of the world. China has a vaccine which is in the advanced state of testing. It be mentioned in the United States. Read the press. When there's talk about vaccines, it's Pfizer, Oxford, barely a mention of the fact, almost never, that China has a vaccine which might come into availability first, but Americans have to be deprived of it. Why? Because we have to undermine Chinese development. This is madness. The Republicans won the election at every level, from state legislatures up to Congress. The only office they didn't win was the presidency, but that was just hatred of Trump, not love of Biden. So what's going to happen? Well, you can guess as well as I can, but we see signs. The signs suggest that President Trump will never concede that he lost the election, actually lost by 6 million votes, but will never concede it. He will presumably leave office on January 20th, the day of the inauguration, but without conceding. The legal maneuverings that are taking place now are ridiculed by liberals and in the world because they're so ludicrous, but they're missing the point. They are very successful. The point of all these legal maneuverings is to energize his popular base, to try to show them that the election was stolen and we're not going to accept it. So it doesn't matter whether they're thrown out by judges who make fun of them. All of that strengthens the feeling that our hero is being cheated by an elite, so-called deep state, which is trying to take our country away from us. That's the purpose. It's succeeding. Over 3/4 of Republicans think that the election was stolen. Solid numbers. And what will very likely happen, can't be sure, maybe it's a bad dream, but what could happen, and what many are anticipating, is that the president will set up an alternative government, the valid, true government, not the fake government in Washington. And his supporters will rally around it. He has control of the Senate. The Senate is finished as a deliberative body. Its sole function is to prevent the Democrats from doing anything. When there's a president in office, just make the country ungovernable. When there's a Republican in office, Mitch McConnell's Senate has had two goals. One, to pass legislation that enriches the very rich and empowers the corporate sector and passes the burden over to the general public. The other is to stack the judiciary, top to bottom, every post, with young, ultra-right lawyers who will be able to block any mildly progressive legislation for a generation, no matter what the public wants. with Trump out of office, it'll go back to the phase where it was under Obama. Just prevent anything from happening. Make the country ungovernable. One of the developments in the past couple of years has been the growth of a kind of a reactionary international. It's not formalized, but it's taking shape. With Trump in the White House, it was led by the White House. It includes the most reactionary states in the world, the ones most bitterly attacking and destroying democracy. In the Western Hemisphere, the leading member is Bolsonaro's Brazil, which is dismantling the shreds of Brazilian democracy. Also, one of the countries not beginning to deal with the pandemic crisis. In the Middle East, it includes the most reactionary states in the world, the Gulf Emirates, Saudi Arabia in particular, United Arab Emirates, includes Egypt under the most reactionary, brutal dictatorship it has ever had, includes Israel, which has gone very far to the right. It's the one country in the world where, maybe the only country where Trump's popularity was overwhelming. Maybe one of the very few countries where the younger generation is more reactionary than the older one. The older one still remembers the social democratic country, which has been disappearing. The recent, what are called Abraham Accords, the agreements between Israel and the Gulf Emirates, which are not peace agreements. There was never any war, but they are bringing to the surface tacit agreements and arrangements that were already there. They are now formalized as part of this growing reactionary international. Moving to the east, Modi's India, destroying the remnants of Indian secular democracy, crushing Muslim rights, placing Kashmir under vicious, brutal rule. That's a natural member. Pakistan is not too far behind. This is the shape of things that are happening. Now, what will happen when the Biden administration comes in? It's actually not very clear. The Democratic Party is torn between two groups. One is the management of the party, Clintonite Democrats, basically, as Clinton once said, moderate Republicans, Wall Street oriented, donor oriented, wanting to continue with the neoliberal programs, which had a devastating effect in the country and, in fact, around the world. We'll talk about that. Trump didn't cause the problems that are being faced. He exaggerated and amplified them, turned them into a kind of caricature, but they were there. So that's the management of the party. And then there's the popular base, mostly younger people. Basically, social democratic. In the American context, they're called radical left. That's a joke. If you look at their policies, they're moderately social democratic. One of the leading commentators of the world's leading business journal, Financial Times, Rana Foroohar, associate editor of the journal, in a sign of a joke, said that if Bernie Sanders was running in Germany, he could join the Christian Democrat Party, the Conservative Party. That's not far from true. If you look at the major problems that Sanders was putting forth that are considered by commentary too radical for Americans, The top one is universal health care. Can you think of a country that doesn't have universal health care? You have to look pretty far to try to find one. It's all over Europe, all over Latin America, Mexico, everywhere you look, almost. The other one is free higher education. Again, find that almost everywhere. That's the radical extreme. These are programs that President Eisenhower wouldn't have been surprised by in the 1950s. Been a sharp shift to the right, but that's one of the consequences of the neoliberal plague, which placed in power the business world to an unusual extent. This happens all over. It's become a plague. We've learned a little about it from leaks like the Panama Papers, which show that it's just colossal in scale. And there have been other similar means. So there's been enormous robbery of the general public. It's not going to the top 10%. Most of it is going to the top 0.1%, tiny fraction of the population, which has doubled their share of wealth in the last 40 years. They now have 20% of the country's entire wealth. Colossal figure. This is 0.1% of the population. This has had a very harmful effect on the functioning of democracy. When you concentrate wealth to that extraordinary extent, it's going to spill over to the way the government functions. That's why the centrist political parties have collapsed. That's why you're getting demagogues like Orban, Le Pen, Salvini, Farage, others. These are the results of 40 years of an assault on the public. And now it's reaching an extreme form with the growth of a reactionary international run by harsh and brutal autocrats. Now, none of this is inevitable. Take any of the crises that we face: nuclear weapons, environmental catastrophe, destruction of democracy, pandemic, others, racism, xenophobia, many others. They have solutions, and we know the solutions. The solutions are feasible and they're in hand. But it's not enough to just have academic knowledge of what to do. Somebody has to take that knowledge and work with it. That's the burden that this generation is facing. It's a severe responsibility, an exciting challenge. If it's not met, we are literally facing the end of organized human society.
Staggering, isn't it? Chris, I'll invite you in a second. I just want to have a quick follow-up, which potentially can have huge consequences for Pakistan. That with all the ungovernability that Trump is planning on leaving behind during this lame duck, do you foresee any kind of strike on Iran or some stoking of war as a possibility?
It's a possibility. In fact, we should say that the sanctions against Iran have absolutely no legitimacy. The sanctions are a means of torturing and terrorizing the population. They're the ones who suffer from the sanctions because the government is not obeying U.S. orders. It has very low military expenditures, very, very low even by the standards of the region, let alone the United States. Its U.S. intelligence informs us that its strategic posture is defensive. And if there are nuclear weapons, it would be part of the deterrent strategy. So what's the threat of Iran? The threat is it's a possible deterrent. Countries that want to rampage freely in the region don't want deterrents. And there are two of them. The United States is the main one. Its Israeli client is the second one. They don't want a deterrent. The United States does not want Israeli nuclear weapons to be inspected. Furthermore, the United States does not even officially recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons. Of course, everyone knows that, but you can't officially recognize it. Will there be a strike? Nobody knows. The Trump administration is in a state where it's willing to do almost anything. We have no way of predicting. For the region, it's a grotesque possibility. For the world as well. I mean, if the U.S. were to attack Iran, it won't be an invasion, of course. It would be an attack from a distance, missiles, stealth bombers, and so on. It's possible that Iran could respond. It has ways to respond. It's a weak military, but they do have missiles. The missiles can reach northeast Saudi Arabia, which happens to be where the main oil production in the world is. They can reach that far. They showed it recently with a demonstration strike just to show the possibilities. If they destroy, that's also the source for Saudi Arabia's water supplies. It's desalination. If they attack that, the results are extraordinary, not just for Saudi Arabia, but for much of the world. It's very likely if that happens, there'll be a massive war, and then we're basically finished. These are all strong possibilities. Go back to the first words I mentioned. We are in an extraordinary situation in human history. Survival is hanging by a thread.
Chris, please.
Very good. Thank you. Professor Chomsky, it's a great honor to speak with you this evening, and my primary responsibility is to put to you as many questions as I can from we solicited in preparation for your lecture questions, and we were inundated with wonderful questions from all around Pakistan and all around the world, in fact. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all. They're all wonderful questions, but I'm going to try and put as many of them to you as I can. In the latest issue of Harper's Magazine, Rana Dasgupta has an essay entitled "The Silenced Majority: Can America Still Afford Democracy?" And he argues in this piece that that what we're witnessing is that over the course of the 20th century, there was a sort of gradual enfranchisement of the American electorate, starting in around 1920. But now and we're now returning to a sort of industrial dispensation where we're seeing a sort of exclusion and mass disenfranchisement simply because the United States can't afford the democracy that we had in much of the 20th century. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't believe that. I think we can easily afford it. What's happened in the last 40 years is that the basic social structure on which a functioning democracy rests has been dismantled. That's the neoliberal programs. You mentioned correctly the decline of manufacturing. You take a look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which gives you the details. Up until 1980, manufacturing continued to grow in employment. From 1980 to the present, employment in manufacturing has declined. Is that because of the digital age? No, it's not. The digital age didn't begin to affect the economy till about the beginning of this millennium, but the process started earlier. The process is a policy decision. It's shown in what are called the trade agreements, the free trade agreements, the World Trade Organization agreement, NAFTA, others. Now, these are not free trade agreements. They are investor rights agreements. There are two crucial elements: are protecting the rights of investors with extraordinary intellectual property rights, patent rights, which have never existed in the past. If they had existed, England would never have developed. It had to steal superior Indian technology. The United States would never have developed, stole superior British technology. Now, what's happened is what economists call kicking away the ladder. We use these measures, nobody else is going to be allowed to. So extraordinary patent rights. It's one of the reasons drug prices are out of sight and pharmaceutical corporations are so super rich. They are protected by extraordinary rights. You can't produce cheap generic drugs. You have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for drugs for cancer or anything. That's one major part of the trade agreements. The other part is setting American workers in competition with the lowest paid workers in the world, with the worst working conditions, the least protection, the least environmental constraints. Well, you can imagine what happens when you do that. The bankers in New York and Washington and Chicago who run the corporations say, why should we produce here? We can get much cheaper labor abroad. That's a policy decision. It's not a law of economics. It's not a law of anything. It's a decision to undermine working people and to enrich the very rich. And that's exactly what's happened. That's why we see numbers like $47 trillion of transfer, of robbery. So could there be manufacturing in the United States? Of course. Doesn't mean, in fact, what there should be in a reasonable world, if you can imagine it, is solidarity between the workers in China and Mexico and Vietnam who want better conditions and workers in the United States and Europe who want decent jobs. They all have the same goals. They can work together to get them. That, however, would be class war. It would be working people in the world taking part in a class war that's ongoing. There is an ongoing class war against them. They're not taking part in it. If they do take part in it, these questions can be resolved.
Mercedes Laoche, a student at the University of Salamanca, asks, can democracy based on capitalism ever permit real betterment for everyone? And if not, can capitalist democracy even be considered truly democratic?
Fundamentally, capitalist democracy is, the phrase is an oxymoron. They're in conflict. And that's well understood by the right wing. To get a job means to rent yourself for most of your waking life to a master who has absolute control over you. If you're working in a General Electric plant, take one of the extreme cases, an Amazon warehouse, you're under total control, more control than Stalin had. Stalin couldn't tell you you can only go to the bathroom at 3 o'clock in the afternoon for 5 minutes. You've got to wear these clothes. You have to take this path to go from here to there. You have to kill 150 chickens an hour in your chicken plant. You can't go lower than that. Those rules are the rules for people's lives for most of their waking hours. This is something pretty recent. If you go back to the beginning of the 19th century, late 19th century, turn of the century, industrial workers strongly opposed this, regarded it as a fundamental assault on their rights, their Republican rights and their dignity. We don't have to have a society in which 90% of the population is ignored in governmental decisions. That's new. That's neoliberalism.
Professor Mohammed Mouini Faizabadi at Habib University asks simply, does socialism have a future in the United States?
Well, it depends what we mean by socialism. What's called socialism these days is mild social democracy. Yes, mild social democracy is possible. It's possible for the United States to have universal health care, free higher education, functioning labor unions, participatory political parties, worker representation on boards of management. All of these things, which are in Europe are called socialism, those are perfectly possible. If you're talking about what socialism used to mean once upon a time, namely control by working people over the workplace, control by communities over communities, that's a long way off, but not impossible. There have been bigger changes in history. But we have to remember that the way the word socialism is used, I'll go back to the joke by the associate editor of the Financial Times, Rana Farrohar. If Sanders was running in Germany, he could be a Christian Democrat.
Very good. I'd like to invite President Rizvi to ask one final question.
Right. Again, expressing our gratitude, Noam. What would be your advice to universities located especially in the global south for reimagining a different intellectual experience, especially in the light of re-engaging with indigenous knowledge as a legitimate intellectual source?
What's the advice to, say, students at the university?
Yes.
Pakistan used to have an advanced scientific establishment, Nobel Prize laureates, and so on. Now science has virtually disappeared from the educational system. It's serious scientists who've been trying to preserve a rational educational system which deals with the reality of the world. Pakistan has no future if it's going to live in a world of religious superstition.
Thank you so much, Noam. Thank you for giving us more than the allotted time that we requested. We are grateful. Habib University is grateful. This has been a memorable day in our short history. Thank you, and look forward to connecting with you.
Very pleased to be with you.